Colin, in trying to solve this age-old mind-body problem, what's the nature of our consciousness? There are two traditional broad solutions: materialism, that only the physical is real, all has to be that, or some kind of dualism, there has to be some other kind of stuff. How do you analyze these two opposing positions?
Yeah, so let's start with dualism. It's the older view. Dualism is the view that there are two kinds of substance in the world. There's matter, and Descartes understood matter to be defined by extension, extended substance. It's a spatial notion. And then there's mental substance or spiritual substance, which is non-spatial substance, and the essence of that, according to Descartes, was thought. And then he had the question of how these two things are connected to each other. And he thought that they interacted with each other. So he thought that events in the brain would cause events in the mind, and events in the mind would cause events in the brain. And this is how perception worked. This is how action worked.
And mind would be some other real kind of stuff.
Mind was a kind of stuff of its own special kind, existing somewhere. Descartes was rather vague about where it might exist, because if it doesn't have extension, it can't be in space. So he had the problem of how the two interact, and that's called the problem of interaction. By what conceivable mechanism could a substance whose definition is to be extended in space interact with something whose definition is to be unextended out of space, whose essence is thought? And Descartes never gave a good answer. Notoriously, he invoked the pineal gland and said various completely incomprehensible things about how the animal spirits might flow through the pineal gland into the mind. How the animal spirits could go from the brain into the mind, as he understood it, is inconceivable, because animal spirits are spatial things. So that was the classic problem with dualism, the problem of interaction. There are other problems too with dualism. Where does the mind come from? What's its origin? If you can join the view to a theistic view of the universe, then at least you can say that God is the cause of the mind. So when a person develops, say from the embryo upwards through childhood to adulthood, the brain is developing on its own track, this way, by physical processes, and Descartes was a mechanist about that. But parallel with that, the mind is developing. How does it change? Where does this change come from? Not from the brain, because that's, according to Descartes, the mind doesn't have its being derived from the brain. So God is somehow propelling the whole process along. What other explanation could we have of that? So you have to bring God in to explain how the mind comes into existence, and also how it develops, because there's no account of the development of the mind in an individual's history. You might hope you could jettison God from the picture, so you have a more scientific version of dualism. And I once played with the idea that there are two universes which have existed for all eternity. There's the material universe, and then there's a conscious universe, which is causally isolated. And at some point in the history of the universe that we have, there was a kind of causal breakthrough between the two. And so the question then is, how do minds develop in the conjoined double universe? They develop from the fact that the consciousness existed in the conscious universe for all eternity. But that's a very far out theory, and as far as I know, nobody's ever maintained that theory. It's extremely extravagant. I certainly don't maintain it.
Not even you. Yeah.
Not even me. I brought it forward to explain what dualism would have to be like in order even to be a coherent position. So for these kinds of reasons, people feel that dualism is a deeply implausible view. There are other reasons which are a bit more esoteric, like what is this non-spatial stuff? How can a stuff be non-spatial? What kind of nature would it have? We have no concept of that.
And you've rejected the dualistic approach with a theistic cause, because that just elevates the problem. If it's a supreme consciousness, well, then how do you get that? So it's just elevating the problem.
Well, it pushes all the problems of God come in to haunt you. Of course, as soon as then you have to have a theory in which you've explained the existence of God. And you've got to be a theist to bring that view into it.
Right.
So if dualism is part of your scientific theory of what a human being is, God is brought in at the very essence of that. And to most people, and to me, that's not an acceptable way to go. And it just pushes the problem back, of course. Yeah. Where did God's mind come
others
from?
Would be panpsychists that say there's a dualistic, something built into the fundamental nature of this one world. You don't need another world, but there's something fundamental about this world that's in proto-psychic form in every piece of matter.
Yeah. Even in an electron, there are going to be some physical properties of the electron, like mass or spin or charge, and then those coexist with a supposed psychic dimension to the electron. And the idea there is that when you bring these particles together into atoms and then into molecules and then into cells, these primitive psychic dimensions will combine to produce a more familiar mental landscape of the kind that we experience. And that has its own problems too.
So you would either happily or sadly reject dualism, whether a theistic view or a non-theistic view, panpsychic or whatever. You'd reject both of those. Right. So now let's go on to the physicalism.
Materialism or physicalism. The problem here really is a problem of definition, or of whether it's a well-defined notion. Materialism used to be well-defined in the time of Descartes. In Descartes' time, Descartes believed in mechanistic physics, where the only recognized entities are extended substances and contact causation. Now, as soon as Newton came along and postulated gravity, that picture was abandoned, because you've got action at a distance, so you don't have contact causation anymore, and you've got what Newton agreed to be an occult force, the force of gravity. That situation only got worse in the subsequent centuries, where electromagnetism was introduced into the picture, where light began to be investigated, and light didn't obey the mechanistic picture at all. And then you went on to to quantum theory and all of those developments. And what happened there? And you get the idea of field and so on. And the expansion of physics that took place from Descartes to now is an enormous expansion. And so the right thing to say really is that materialism isn't true of physics either, because the only well-defined notion of materialism is mechanism. But mechanism is not true in physics. We had to expand the entities recognized in physics way beyond the entities of Descartes' mechanism. So Descartes, looking at physics now, would say, well, the world isn't a physical world, because that's the only well-defined notion.
But today we're expanding our definition of what physicalism or materialism really is in terms of the totality of physics. They just didn't know, but in today's world, that is materialism. So is that sufficient to explain consciousness?
Let me point out this problem with that. When people started introducing things like electromagnetic forces, they called them immaterial forces. They were not material. Were they physical? No, they weren't physical in the way the physicists then understood the notion.
Not contact physical, yeah.
Right, not contact physical, not extended, and they violated all the usual principles about the way particles operate and so on. What happened was, this is a point Chomsky's made many times, is that physical is an honorific label. And people professionally interested in those subjects will call something physical when they find that it's needed to figure in their theories. They'll say, well, let's call it physical. For a while, they'll wonder, is it really physical? And then they'll just get used to calling it physical or material. But the term itself long ago lost any real substantive meaning. So if tomorrow the physicists, which are just a group of people, discover some completely new force, completely new dimension of the natural world, will they say they've discovered something non-physical? Some at first will say, this is nothing like what we have so far, and those people say, it's immaterial, non-material. Others will say, well, we discovered it, and we're physicists, so let's call it material. So suppose they were to discover that panpsychism is true. Suppose they found that they couldn't explain the movements of particles in terms of the usual physical properties, and they found they had to postulate will-like properties in there. Then they would say that these properties were physical.
Right.
So
physicalism becomes an open-ended...
It's so open-ended. So if the question is physicalism true, the answer is vacuously so. It is. Because the mind is part of the natural world. The mind results from the ordinary natural world, from biology and evolution and so on. It's part of that world. So in a very broad sense, it's part of the material world. I myself think there's no objection to describing consciousness as a form of matter. Because in the way I see it, matter has many forms. One form is extended particles, another form is electromagnetic energy, another is gravitational force, and there are others that could be postulated. Dark matter, there are other ideas. Light is one form of matter.
Well, if you embed consciousness as another form of matter, you're using matter as a synonym for anything. All there is.
All there is. You could justify it a little bit more by saying, well, there were various systematic connections between all these things. So there's a connection between the form of matter called consciousness and other forms of matter called, for example, kinetic energy, because kinetic energy can be transformed into consciousness through eating food and so on, right? So our conscious thoughts, which have energy in them because they make things happen, they result from the energy we've taken in, ultimately from the sun. And so we can say that in that sense, there are these connections, and consciousness is a form of matter or of energy.